I found the right words, you must remember that I've always earned my living by my pen and by my tongue.
Churchill book collector, specializing in works by and about Sir Winston S. Churchill and collectible works by all authors.
I'm Marc Kuritz of Churchill Book Collector. I'm here with my colleague Aaron to talk about a noteworthy set of Winston Churchill's biography of his great ancestor John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. Winston Churchill published nearly 60 books during his lifetime, over a span of more than 60 years. For much of that literary career, Churchill was a popular and highly successful author. Nonetheless, there is only one work by Churchill for which the publisher issued a signed, limited, and finely bound first edition. That's Marlborough, His Life and Times. Marlborough was published in 4 volumes between 1933 and 1938. The publisher, George Harrop, produced 150 of these finely bound, numbered, and signed sets. Both the contents and the bindings were unique. Unlike the trade issue of the first edition, which you can see here, each of these 150 was printed on thick, laid paper, with untrimmed fore and bottom edges and gilt top edges. The contents were sumptuously bound by Leighton Straker in reddish-orange Niger morocco, with raised and blind rule-bordered spine bands, gilt rules at the spine ends, the Churchill arms and gilt on the front covers, orange and yellow head and tail bands, and marbled end papers. Volume 1 of each set was signed by Churchill on the limitation page and hand-numbered. These 150 sets are coveted, so it's easy to dismiss the presence of an old bookplate. But the bookplate in each volume of set number 107, which we have here, happens to be the armorial bookplate of Buchanan Dunlop. That turns out to be provenance worth noting. This particular set was owned by a family enmeshed in both the humanity and horrors of the great 20th century struggles that bracketed publication of Marlborough, the First and Second World Wars. I'm going to let Aaron tell you a bit more about why Buchanan Dunlop is a name we should all know.
Thank you, Marc. The First World War was only a month old when Benedict XV ascended to the papacy. The first 4 of his 7.5 years as Pope were consumed by diplomatic attempts to quash the conflict he described as the suicide of civilized Europe. But secular exhortations proved no match for the terrible pent political and military forces that had been unleashed. That November, Benedict XV said of the combatants in his Ad Battissimi Epistolorum encyclical, "Well provided with the most awful weapons modern military science has devised, they strive to destroy one another with refinements of horror. There is no limit to the measures of ruin and of slaughter. Day by day, the earth is drenched with newly shed blood and is covered with the bodies of the wounded and of the slain." The Pope pressed his impassioned appeal for peace on December 7th. He called for the hiatus from war to last at least over the holiday, so that, quote, "the guns may fall silent, at least upon the night the angels sing." His request for an official ceasefire was universally ignored. Almost. A truce came, but not on the scale of secular institutions, nation-states, and official decrees, but instead through a modest package delivered to a British officer on the edge of the cold, muddy morass of no man's land in Ypres. The recipient was Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Henry Buchanan Dunlop. He had written to his mother about how he missed the songs the students would sing at the chapel of Loretto School, where he had been a student and a teacher. The package from his mother contained a small program, a book of carols for their school's annual Christmas production. On Christmas Day, Buchanan Dunlop organized an impromptu song among his company, which quickly erupted with more and more soldiers joining down the trenches. The Germans responded in kind, each side cheering after the other. Soldiers climbed out of their trenches and shook hands with their enemies. Some exchanged gifts of cigarettes and plum puddings. There was even a documented case of soldiers from opposing sides playing a good-natured game of soccer. In retrospect, historical accounts tend to garland a single individual as the sole instigator of an event. In this way, of course, it might be overzealous to ascribe the 1914 Christmas Truce wholly to Buchanan Dunlop, but only marginally so. In a letter he sent to his wife on Christmas Day 1914, Buchanan Dunlop wrote, "Even out here, this is a time of peace and goodwill. I've just spent an hour talking to the German officers and men who have drawn a line halfway between our left trenches and theirs. and have all met our men and officers there. We exchange cigars, cigarettes, and papers. They are jolly, cheery fellows for the most part, and it seems so silly under the circumstances to be fighting them. It's clear from the remainder of the letter that Buchanan Dunlop did not take credit for the truce, a testament to his character. But letters sent from fellow soldiers name him as the cause. 2014 marked the centennial anniversary of the fabled events, and a remembrance for the man who was said to have, even if only for a moment, stopped the First World War. Stained glass windows were commissioned in commemoration of the truce, which have been installed in Loretto School's chapel. Descendants of Buchanan Dunlop, as well as those of the German officer involved in the truce, Hauptmann Maximilian Freyer von Sinner, congregated as their forebears did, during the unveiling of the windows, which in Latin reads, Gloria in excelsis Deo et in terra pax, meaning, glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace. Many of the men who sang and shook hands on Christmas 1914 did not survive. They returned to exchanging fire. It went on for nearly 4 more desperately bloody and destructive years. Then it all began anew in 1939. The First World War had been called the Great War, and even the war to end all wars. Only 4 decades into the 20th century, the world was already jaded. The next global conflict became merely the Second World War. And in that sequel, 3 of Archibald Henry Buchanan Dunlop's own sons took up arms and served.
Thanks, Aaron. During the First World War, Winston Churchill served both in the British cabinet and as a lieutenant colonel in the trenches. As was the case for the Buchanan Dunlop family, the First World War would not be Churchill's last. Marlborough was initially conceived a full 40 years before publication of the final volume. Churchill originally considered the idea of the biography in 1898, returning to it in earnest in 1928. Marlborough ultimately took 10 years of research and writing, and is the most substantial published work of Churchill's wilderness years in the 1930s. It's a time when he spent politically isolated, often at odds with his own party and prevailing public sentiment. When he was writing Marlborough, Churchill passed into his 60s with his own future as uncertain as that of his nation. Churchill may have wondered more than once if the life history he was writing would ultimately eclipse his own. History was not done with Churchill. The 4th and final Marlborough volume was published almost exactly 1 year before the outbreak of the Second World War and Churchill's return to the cabinet to reprise his First World War role as First Lord of the Admiralty. 20 months after the final volume was published, Churchill became wartime Prime Minister. There is a reason it's been said that to understand the Churchill of the Second World War, the majestic blending of his commanding English with historical precedent, one has to read Marlborough. When Churchill was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953, it was partly for mastery of historical and biographical description on the strength of Marlborough, which was specifically cited and quoted by the Swedish Academy. When Volume 1 was published, Churchill's friend T.E. Lawrence, known to the world as Lawrence of Arabia, wrote to Churchill, "I finished it only yesterday. I wish I had not. The skeleton of the book is so good, its parts balance, and the mainstream flows. Marlborough has the big scene painting, the informed pictures of men, the sober comment on political method, the humor, irony, and understanding of your normal writing. But beyond that, it shows more discipline and strength and great dignity. It is history, solemn and decorative." This finely bound, limited and numbered, and signed edition suits the decorative dignity of Churchill's words. And the association of the set with Buchanan Dunlop speaks to the great tides of history to which Churchill's life and literary legacy belong. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Visit us at www.churchillbookcollector.com or direct any inquiries to info@churchillbookcollector.com.